For a long time, the world believed wars were decided by generals, by bold strategies, and by the courage of soldiers on the battlefield. But during the Second World War, something unprecedented began to unfold far away from the front lines. Something so overwhelming that, long before the final shots were fired, the outcome of the war was already becoming clear, not in trenches, not in the sky, but inside American factories. In Europe and the Pacific, enemy officers studied maps late into the night, searching for ways to stop the advance of American forces. They planned ambushes, counteroffensives, desperate last stands. Yet slowly, painfully, another realization began to creep in. No matter how well they fought, no matter how many battles they won, they were facing something they could not destroy, bomb, or blockade: the full industrial power of the United States. German intelligence reported in 1942 and 1943 began to include numbers that felt unreal. American aircraft production was accelerating at a pace that defied logic. Entire air fleets lost over Europe were being replaced faster than Germany could build a fraction of them. Tank divisions destroyed in North Africa were reappearing months later, stronger and better equipped. For German planners trained to think in terms of scarcity, this was incomprehensible. War, as they understood it, was about limits. America seemed to have none. Across the Atlantic, while Europe burned, American cities transformed themselves almost overnight. Automobile plants stopped producing cars and began producing bombers. Shipyards that once built commercial vessels now launched warships at a pace never seen before in human history. Liberty ships slid into the water so quickly that enemy submarines could not sink them fast enough to matter. Every launch was a silent message to the world. This war would be fought on America's terms. Inside these factories worked millions of Americans who would never fire a shot in anger, yet whose contribution would prove just as decisive. Farmers became machinists, housewives became riveters, teenagers and retirees stood shoulder to shoulder on assembly lines, driven by a shared belief that the war had to be won, not someday, but completely. To them, production was patriotism. Every bolt tightened, every wing riveted, every shell packed into crates was a blow against tyranny. Enemy prisoners of war noticed it almost immediately when they arrived in the United States. Many had been taught America was soft, divided, incapable of sustained effort. What they saw instead were endless trains loaded with supplies, fuel, food, vehicles, and weapons, moving with relentless efficiency. Some German POWs later admitted that this was the moment their belief in victory truly died, not on the battlefield, but while watching American logistics roll past without end. In Japan, naval planners faced a similar nightmare. Before the war, they believed the United States lacked the resolve for a prolonged conflict. But by 1943, American aircraft carriers were appearing in numbers that defied prediction. Each loss was answered with 2 new ships. Each destroyed air group was replaced with pilots trained faster than Japan could possibly match. Japanese officers spoke quietly among themselves about a growing certainty. Even flawless tactics could not overcome an enemy that could endlessly replace what was lost. What made this industrial force truly devastating was not just its size, but its coordination. American factories did not work in isolation. They were part of a system that connected steel mills to railroads, ports to airfields, farms to the front lines. Food arrived hot, ammunition arrived on time, spare parts arrived before breakdowns could cripple units.
Soldiers at the front came to trust that whatever they needed, America would find a way to deliver it. German soldiers captured after major battles often spoke of this psychological weight. They described facing American units that seemed inexhaustible. If one attack failed, another followed. If one division withdrew, another took its place. There was no pause, no breathing room. The war felt less like a series of battles and more like standing in front of a rising tide that could not be stopped.
Even high-ranking enemy officers began to acknowledge the truth in private diaries and post-war interviews. The war, they admitted, was lost not when cities fell or armies surrendered, but when the scale of American production became undeniable. By then, strategy could only delay the inevitable. Victory had already been manufactured. This industrial might did not make American soldiers invincible. They still suffered, bled, and died in terrible numbers, but it gave them something no enemy could match: confidence. Confidence that losses would be replaced, confidence that support would arrive, confidence that the nation behind them was fully committed, not just in words, but in steel, oil, and manpower. By the final years of the war, the enemy was no longer trying to win, they were trying to survive. And even that became impossible. The factories never stopped, the ships never stopped sailing, the planes never stopped flying. What began as an industrial response became an unstoppable force that reshaped the course of history. When the war finally ended, many veterans reflected on what had truly carried them through. They spoke not only of bravery and sacrifice, but of the feeling that an entire nation was fighting alongside them. The United States did not simply send soldiers to war. It sent its farms, its factories, its railroads, its cities, and its people. In the end, the enemy was not defeated by one battle or one weapon. They were defeated by a realization that came too late. You cannot outfight a nation that can outbuild the world. And on the day that truth became clear, victory was no longer a question of if, only when.
As the war dragged on, the difference between the United States and its enemies became impossible to hide. In occupied Europe, civilians whispered about American supply convoys that seemed endless. In German barracks, soldiers joked bitterly that fighting the Americans felt like fighting a machine that never tired, never slept, and never ran out of fuel. What began as dark humor slowly turned into dread. On the front lines, American units rotated out of combat in ways the enemy could barely comprehend. Worn-down divisions were pulled back, re-equipped, reinforced, and sent forward again, stronger than before. Meanwhile, opposing units remained in the field until they were shattered beyond repair. German soldiers noticed the difference in uniforms alone. American troops arrived with clean gear, fresh boots, and new weapons, while German supplies grew thinner, older, and more improvised with each passing month. Captured enemy soldiers often described the same haunting image: American depots stretching as far as the eye could see, rows upon rows of vehicles, mountains of ammunition crates, fuel drums stacked like city walls. For men raised in systems where scarcity was constant, this abundance was psychologically crushing. It told them that no matter how hard they fought, they were being outmatched not just by soldiers, but by an entire civilization mobilized for war.
Back in the United States, production continued at a pace that shocked even American leaders. By 1944, the country was producing aircraft so quickly that airfields struggled to store them. Some planes were flown directly from factories to overseas bases with barely any delay. Shipyards launched vessels faster than crews could be trained to man them. The war effort had become a self-sustaining force, feeding on its own momentum. Enemy intelligence agencies tried desperately to assess how long this could last. Surely, they believed, such an effort would exhaust the American people. Surely morale would break, but it never did. If anything, each victory fueled more production. Each sacrifice strengthened resolve. The American home front did not fracture, it hardened. In prisoner of war camps, German and Italian soldiers were exposed to a reality they had never been allowed to see. Newspapers openly reported production numbers. Radios spoke freely about new factories, new contracts, new weapons. There was no secrecy because there was no need for it. America was not hiding its strength. It was displaying it openly, almost casually. Some POWs later admitted that this openness was more disturbing than propaganda. It meant the numbers were real, the scale was real, and it meant the war was no longer a contest between armies, but between systems, and one system was clearly winning. In the Pacific, the same pattern repeated itself on a terrifying scale. Islands once considered impregnable were overwhelmed not by reckless assaults, but by sustained pressure. Each American landing was supported by waves of ships, aircraft, and supplies that simply did not stop coming. Japanese defenders fought with extraordinary determination, but even they began to understand the imbalance. They were defending isolated positions against a nation that could afford to lose ships, planes, and men, and still keep advancing.
American soldiers themselves felt the weight of this support. Letters home often mentioned how surreal it felt to receive hot meals, fresh ammunition, and medical care under conditions where previous wars would have meant starvation and abandonment. The message was clear: the country would not let them fight alone. By late 1944, enemy leadership faced an uncomfortable truth. Tactical brilliance no longer mattered, courage no longer mattered, even survival no longer mattered. The war had become a matter of time. Every day the conflict continued only increased America's advantage. Every delay only allowed more ships to launch, more tanks to roll off assembly lines, more pilots to graduate from training. When Allied forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, they did not slow down, they accelerated. Supply lines grew longer, yet stronger. Logistics officers performed feats that would have been considered impossible only a decade earlier. Entire armies moved as if pulled forward by an invisible force, the industrial engine behind them. After the war, historians would argue endlessly about strategy, leadership, and battlefield decisions. But among the men who fought against the United States, there was little debate. They had seen the truth firsthand. The war was lost the moment America fully committed its economy, its workforce, and its identity to victory. This was not just a military achievement. It was a national transformation. The United States emerged from the war not only victorious, but changed, proven capable of mobilizing its entire society without losing its unity. A nation once accused of isolationism had become the defining force of the modern world. And perhaps that is the most unsettling legacy for America's enemies. Not that they were defeated in battle, but that they were defeated by a country that fought with factories as fiercely with rifles, with assembly lines as powerfully as with armies. The Second World War taught the world a lesson it would never forget. When the United States decides that something must be done, it does not do it halfway, it does it completely. And once that machine is in motion, there is no stopping it, only standing in its path and realizing too late that the outcome was decided long before the final battle was ever fought.
As the war entered its final phase, the contrast between America and its enemies no longer needed explanation. It was visible everywhere. In the ruins of European cities, German soldiers watched American columns roll past with equipment that looked almost untouched by war. Trucks ran smoothly, radios worked flawlessly, weapons were clean, standardized, familiar to every soldier who carried them. This consistency mattered. It meant fewer mistakes, fewer delays, fewer moments of vulnerability. For the enemy, inconsistency had become a way of life. Ammunition types didn't match weapons. Fuel was rationed down to the last drop. Repairs were improvised with scrap and hope. Each day brought another reminder that their war effort was shrinking while America's was expanding. Many German veterans would later admit that by 1944, they no longer believed in victory, only in endurance. American logistics became so dominant that entire operations were planned around the assumption of overwhelming support. Commanders knew that bridges destroyed today could be replaced tomorrow. Roads bombed by the enemy would be repaired overnight. Airfields carved out of farmland would be operational within days. This certainty changed how Americans fought. They could take risks others could not afford, knowing that recovery was always possible. Enemy soldiers felt this difference in morale immediately. They described American troops as calm under pressure, not because they were fearless, but because they trusted what stood behind them. Trust is a weapon rarely discussed, yet devastating when one side has it and the other does not. In POW camps, conversations among captured soldiers grew quieter as the war progressed. Early bravado vanished. Men stopped arguing about tactics and began asking questions about America itself. How could a country so far away produce so much? How could it move so quickly? How could it feed, equip, and replace entire armies without collapsing? The answers were all around them. Camps were supplied efficiently. Guards were rotated regularly. Food was consistent. Rules were enforced, but not cruelly. For many prisoners, this order was unsettling. It contradicted everything they had been taught about American weakness. Some later wrote that captivity itself became proof that their leaders had lied to them. Meanwhile, at home, American civilians barely recognized the nation they had become. Towns once known for farming or small manufacturing were now critical nodes in a global war machine. Shift whistles replaced church bells as the sound of daily life. Yet despite the pressure, despite the long hours and constant loss, the country did not fracture. It adapted. Women who had never worked outside the home became experts in welding, machining, and engineering. Minorities who had been excluded from opportunity demanded and earned their place in the workforce. The war accelerated social change in ways no enemy bomb ever could. America was not just producing weapons, it was reshaping itself. This mattered deeply to the soldiers fighting overseas. Letters from home spoke of sacrifice, of pride, of shared purpose. The knowledge that the entire nation was invested in the outcome gave American troops a psychological edge no training manual could teach.